There are places in the American South where time moves differently than it does everywhere else. Not slower, exactly, just more deliberate. Like the land itself has decided that certain things are worth taking seriously, and rushing them would be a kind of disrespect. Hatchett's Crossing, Louisiana, in the summer of 1891, was that kind of place. And in that kind of place, there is always one person who becomes the quiet center of everything without ever trying to be. Not the loudest, not the most powerful, just the one everyone unconsciously orients toward, the way a room full of compasses all point the same direction without consulting each other. In Hatchett's Crossing, that person was Nell Archer. She was 28 years old, the daughter of the town's only pharmacist. With dark hair she kept in a loose braid during the workday and brown eyes that had the particular quality of paying attention. She ran her father's accounts when his hands began to shake 2 years ago, and she did it without making a fuss about the fact that she was doing it. She baked for the church when the deacon's wife fell ill. She remembered the names of people's children and their animals with equal seriousness. She was not performing goodness. She simply had not learned to be otherwise. Every eligible man in Calhoun Parish had noticed Nell Archer. Several of them had done considerably more than notice their flowers left at the pharmacy kofter, at least one formally worded letter, delivered by a nervous cousin acting as intermediary. A timber merchant from Shreveport had reportedly told her father, Cyrus Archer, that he would consider it a great personal honor, which Cyrus had relayed to Nell with the careful neutrality of a man who understood his daughter made her own decisions. Nell had declined all of them, without cruelty, without coldness, with the kind of genuine warmth that made the men feel, afterward, that they had not been rejected so much as gently redirected, which was perhaps worse because there was nothing to argue with. People had theories, the way people in small towns always do when something doesn't fit the expected shape of things. She was too particular. She was waiting for someone from New Orleans. She had some private sorrow that had closed that door. None of them were right. The answer was simpler than any of the theories, and considerably more inconvenient, because it had a name. The name was Fletcher Cade. And Fletcher Cade was the only man in Hatchett's Crossing who had never once considered the question. Fletcher was 31 years old and ran the cooperage on the south side of town, making barrels for the sugar operations that moved along the river. He was not the most prosperous man in Calhoun Parish. He was not, strictly speaking, the most remarkable. Medium height, shoulders built by a decade of physical work, hands that were permanently stained with oak tannin, no matter how thoroughly he washed them. He had a way of listening that made people feel, wrongly, that he was slow. He was not slow. He was simply one of those rare people who does not speak until he has something to say. What Fletcher Cade was, without question, was steady. He had taken over the cooperage when his father died and made it profitable inside of 2 years through the simple method of doing good work and charging honest prices. When the flooding came in 1889 and the Tatum family lost their smokehouse, Fletcher had spent 3 Saturdays helping rebuild it and declined to discuss it afterward. He was the kind of man who did not announce his decency. He simply enacted it quietly and moved on. He and Nell had known each other the way people know each other in small towns, which is to say completely and not at all. They had grown up attending the same church, the same socials, the same harvest suppers. They argued amiably about inconsequential things. He brought his father's prescriptions to the pharmacy counter, and she filled them, and they talked about the weather and the price of timber and the state of the river road. And neither of them had ever stepped outside that comfortable, unexamined arrangement. Fletcher looked at Nell the way a man looks at something he has always taken for granted. Not unkindly, not deliberately, simply with the blindness of familiarity, the particular inability to see clearly what has always been there. He came into the pharmacy on a Tuesday morning in late June for a tin of headache powder, and found her behind the counter doing the accounts, pencil behind her ear, brow furrowed in the particular way she had when a column wasn't balancing. She looked up when the bell above the door rang. "Morning, Fletcher," she said, and went back to her column. "Morning, Nell," he said, and waited at the counter. She found the error. He could tell from the small exhale she made, satisfied and quiet. She came to the counter, found his headache powder on the shelf behind her, wrapped it in paper, told him the price. He paid it. "You look like the numbers won," he said. "The numbers always win eventually," she said. "You just have to be patient with them." He left. On the front steps, Raymond Pruitt, who had been refused by Nell twice and had arrived at a philosophical accommodation with that fact, looked at Fletcher and shook his head. "You know," Raymond said, "for a man who fits things together for a living, you have a remarkable inability to see what's right in front of you." Fletcher squinted at him. "What are you talking about?" Raymond looked at the sky. "Nothing," he said. "Not a thing." But Raymond was thinking about something Fletcher didn't know, that a man named Garland Fitch had arrived in Hatchett's Crossing the previous week. Garland Fitch, who was 44 years old and had made a considerable amount of money in cotton brokerage in Natchitoches, and who had a cousin in town who had, apparently, spoken to him about Nell Archer, and who had been asking quiet, deliberate questions ever since. The kind of questions a man asks before he makes a move. The Hatchett's Crossing 4th of July social was held on the grounds of the Methodist Church, as it always was, with tables set up under the oaks, and the inevitable argument about whose pie was better. A contest that had been running for approximately 11 years, with no resolution in sight. Nell did not particularly want to go. She had a headache, and the accounts were still not entirely reconciled, and she would have preferred the quiet of the pharmacy porch, with a glass of sweet tea. But her mother had made a coconut cake that required transport, and her father's hands made it difficult for him to carry things, and so she went. She wore a pale blue dress with white eyelet at the collar. She carried the cake. She arrived with the composure of a woman who has learned to be cheerful about obligations, which is a different thing from actually being cheerful, though most people can't tell the difference. Garland Fitch arrived an hour into the afternoon. He was, she noticed immediately, a man who understood how to enter a room, or a churchyard as the case was. He was well dressed without being ostentatious. He had the particular confidence of a man who has been successful long enough that it no longer requires demonstration. He was introduced to her by his cousin, Margaret Fitch, with the slightly too careful casualness of someone who has arranged something and is pretending they haven't. He asked if he could bring her a glass of lemonade. She said yes, because it would have been rude not to. He was pleasant, educated. He asked her questions and listened to the answers, which put him ahead of several men she had met. He was also, she noticed, watching her with a particular quality of assessment, not unkind, just deliberate. The kind of man who, once he decided on something, organized his life accordingly. Across the yard, Fletcher arrived late, his good shirt slightly rumpled from where he'd had to change. Quickly, after a barrel hoop, gave him trouble at the cooperage. He collected a piece of pie from the table and stood in the comfortable way of a man who is happy enough anywhere. He saw Nell talking to the man in the good coat. Thought vaguely that she seemed like she was being polite, in the effortful way rather than the easy way. She caught his eye across the yard, smiled. Not the public smile she'd been wearing all afternoon. The other one, the quick one, private, just for him, there, gone before anyone could account for it. He smiled back, lifted his fork slightly in greeting. Then Buck Alderman materialized at his elbow, wanting to discuss whether the river road would hold through August, and Fletcher turned his attention to the river road with the uncomplicated ease of a man who has no idea what he just missed. Across the yard, Nell watched him turn away. Then she looked back at Garland Fitch, who was watching her with that careful, patient attention, and she felt something she had not allowed herself to feel before. Not quite fear, something more specific than that. The first cold edge of the understanding that waiting has a cost, and that she had perhaps not been paying close enough attention to what that cost was accumulating into. 4 days after the social, Nell was sweeping the pharmacy porch when her father came to the door and said, without preamble, that Garland Fitch had stopped in the day before. Nell kept sweeping. "Not for medicine," Cyrus said. He lowered himself into the porch chair with the careful movement of a man whose joints have begun to register their objections. "He asked after you, your situation, whether you had any particular attachments." The broom slowed. "He's a serious man," Cyrus said, in the careful tone of a father who has an opinion and is trying to present it as information. "Stable. Established. The Fitch operation in Natchitoches is well regarded." He was quiet for a moment. "I told him you made your own decisions, because you do." He looked at her. "I thought you should know." Nell finished the porch. She set the broom against the wall. She sat down on the step. "Papa," she said, "do you know why I've said no to every man who's asked? I have some thoughts on the subject. They involve Fletcher Cade." "They do." She was quiet for a moment. "He doesn't see it. I've known for 3 years that I love him, and he looks at me like I'm part of the furniture, familiar, comfortable." She stopped, started again. "He's kind to me the way he's kind to everyone, and I cannot tell anymore if that's a mercy or a cruelty." Cyrus was quiet. "Garland Fitch is a reasonable man," Nell said. "And if Fletcher doesn't—" She stopped. "How long does a person wait, Papa, before it stops being patience and starts being something else?" Her father looked at the oak tree at the edge of the road. He had watched that tree for 30 years from this same porch. "That depends," he said carefully, "on whether the person you're waiting for has any idea you're waiting." Nell didn't answer, but the answer was obvious to both of them. He didn't know. He had never known. And she had never told him. Raymond Pruett found Fletcher at the cooperage on a Thursday morning and delivered the information directly because Raymond had decided that the time for subtlety had definitively passed. "Garland Fitch is going to make a formal offer for Nell Archer," he said. "Probably within the month. His cousin is already talking to her mother." Fletcher was sanding a stave. He did not stop immediately. "Where'd you hear that?" "From Margaret Fitch, who told her husband, who told my brother-in-law, who told me." Raymond leaned against the workbench. "The chain of information is undignified but reliable." Fletcher set down the stave. "I'm telling you," Raymond said, "because you're my oldest friend, and because I have watched you be oblivious about this particular thing for going on 4 years, and I have run out of patience for watching it." "Watching what?" Raymond looked at him with the expression of a man who has rehearsed this conversation, find the reality of it more frustrating than the rehearsal. "Fletcher," he said, "do you understand that Nell Archer has told no to every man in this parish for 3 years? Do you understand that there is a reason for that? Do you understand that you are the reason and that she has never said so, because you have never given her a single reason to think you saw her as anything other than a neighbor you're fond of?" The cooperage was quiet. Somewhere in the back, a wood joint settled. Fletcher looked at Raymond for a long moment. "She'd never." He started. "She has," Raymond said, "for years." He pushed off from the workbench. "And Garland Fitch doesn't know that, and if you wait much longer, she is going to have to make a different kind of decision, and you will have no right whatsoever to have any feelings about it." He left. Fletcher stood in the cooperage for a long time after that. He picked up the stave he'd been sanding, set it down again, looked at his hands, the oak stain that was always there. The hands that had built and fixed and made things for 10 years, and had apparently, in all that time, failed to reach for the one thing that mattered. Garland Fitch, within the month. He thought about the smile across the churchyard, the quick one, the one that was different from the others, and that he had, with the oblivious confidence of a man who doesn't know what he's looking at, simply smiled back at and turned away from. He set down the stave very carefully. Then he started thinking about what a man says when he has waited too long and knows it, and has to say something anyway. It was a Saturday afternoon in August, the kind of Louisiana August that makes the air feel like something you could cut with a knife, when Nell came out of the dry goods store and nearly walked into Fletcher Cade, standing on the boardwalk. He had clearly been waiting. He had his hat in his hands, which was not a thing he usually did, and he had the expression of a man who has made a decision and is committed to it, even though every part of him would prefer to be somewhere else. "Can I walk with you?" he asked. She looked at him. "I'm only going to the pharmacy." "I know where the pharmacy is." She started walking. He fell into step beside her. They walked half a block in silence, which was not unusual for them. They were comfortable with silence, except that this silence felt different, weighted in a way she couldn't quite account for. Then he said, "I heard about Fitch." She kept walking. "I don't have any standing to say anything about it," he said. "I know that. I haven't given myself any standing, and that's—" He stopped, tried again. "I've been thinking about why I haven't. And I think the honest answer is that I convinced myself it wasn't possible. That a woman like you would never." He stopped again. "I was wrong about that. I understand I was wrong about it." They had reached the front of the pharmacy. She stopped at the steps. She didn't go up them. She turned and looked at him. He was looking at his hat. "I should have said something a long time ago," he said. "I know that. I don't have a good reason for why I didn't. Only a true one, which is that I didn't think I was someone you'd consider, and I'd rather have you as a neighbor I see every day than risk losing that by saying something foolish." He finally looked up. "But I'm going to say the foolish thing now, because I think not saying it is worse." The street was quiet. A mule cart went by without hurrying. "I love you, Nell," he said. "I think I have for a long time without letting myself call it that, and I know that's. I know I'm late. I know Fitch is a good man, and I'm a man who makes barrels and has oak stain on his hands at all hours." A pause. "But I see you, and I don't want to watch someone else see you and do nothing about it." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "Fletcher Cade, I have been waiting for you to say something like that for 3 years." He stared at her. 3 years, she said. "I said no to Roy Hatcher, and I said no to the Fontenot cousin, and I said no to the timberman from Shreveport, and I said no to all of them because none of them were you." She held his gaze. "I am not a woman who waits indefinitely. I want you to understand that." "I was getting close to the end of what I had to wait with." He was very still. "But you're here now," she said. "So." She went up one step, then turned back. "Come to Sunday supper tomorrow. I'll tell my mother to set an extra plate. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. What state or country are you listening from today? Drop it in the comments below. It means more than you know to hear where these stories are reaching. Now let's go back, because Fletcher Cade still has a conversation to have with Cyrus Archer. He came to Sunday supper. He wore his good coat. He had, Nell noticed, done something deliberate with his hair. He brought a jar of sourwood honey from the apiary outside of town, because he had remembered from some conversation 2 years ago that Cyrus Archer preferred it above all other things on his biscuits. The fact that he had remembered this and acted on it told her more than a formal speech would have. Cyrus Archer was a quiet man who had spent 30 years reading people across a pharmacy counter. He shook Fletcher's hand, looked at him steadily, and said, "Nell tells me you came to your senses." "Yes, sir," Fletcher said. "Took me longer than it should have." "It did," Cyrus agreed pleasantly, and let him into the house. They ate. Eleanor Archer, Nell's mother, had made a Sunday roast and 2 kinds of pie, which was the household's equivalent of a formal declaration of welcome. The conversation ranged across everything and nothing: the river, the state of the parish roads, a dispute about property lines 3 streets over that had been generating gossip for months. Fletcher was at ease in the way that genuinely good-natured people are at ease, not performing comfort, but simply being comfortable. Nell watched him across the table. She had imagined this in the abstract for 3 years. The specific reality of it was different from the imagining, better in the way that real things are usually better than their imagined versions, more complicated and more true. He was not performing anything. He was just there, the same as he always was, except that now what had always been between them had a name and a place to stand. After supper, he asked Cyrus quietly if he might call on Nell properly, starting now if that was acceptable. Cyrus said it was acceptable. He walked her to the porch in the evening air, the August heat finally releasing its grip in the hour before dark, and they sat on the steps and talked until Eleanor came to the door and said, gently, that it was getting on toward 9 o'clock. "I'll come Tuesday," he said. "I'll be here," she said. It was, by the standards of Hatchett's Crossing, the most discussed courtship in recent memory. He brought her things he had noticed rather than things he had purchased. A stem of wisteria from the fence along the river road, a book of Louisiana bird illustrations from the lending library, because she had mentioned once in the middle of a conversation about something else entirely, that she'd always meant to learn more about the herons. He fixed the pharmacy's front step, which had been slightly uneven for 2 years, without being asked and without mentioning it. She, in turn, looked at his accounts and discovered that he had been so focused on the work of the cooperage that the billing had drifted into a comfortable approximation of accuracy that was costing him money. She corrected this with the brisk efficiency of a woman who grew up in commerce. He did not argue. He brought her a pie from the Tatum bakery by way of thanks, which made her laugh, because it was exactly the kind of thing he would do. On an October Sunday, they rode out to the bluff above the river, where you could see the cypress swamps going gold in the autumn light, the Spanish moss silver and still. "Why me?" he asked, in the honest way he asked things. There were men with more to offer. She thought about it seriously, because he deserved a serious answer. "Because you never tried to be anything," she said. "Every other man who came around was presenting me with something, his land, his prospects, his family name, his plans. You just showed up the same every time. Yourself." She looked at the river below. "I always knew exactly who you were. That is a rarer thing than people seem to understand." He was quiet for a moment. "Fitch is a decent man," he said. "He is. You could have, Fletcher." She turned to look at him directly. "I waited for you because I wanted to. Not because I had no other options, because you were the option I wanted." She held his gaze. "I'd prefer not to have to explain that twice." He looked at her. This woman who had carried something quietly and without complaint for 3 years and had offered it to him without conditions and without making him feel at any point the weight of how long she had carried it. He took her hand. The river was going gold below them. The cypress trees were doing what they do in October, turning the color of fire and letting it go. Something that had been patient for a very long time sat down on that bluff and stopped waiting. He asked her on a November evening outside the pharmacy after the harvest social, when the air had turned cold enough that their breath made small clouds in the lamplight. He had his grandmother's ring in his coat pocket, a simple gold band with a small garnet which had been in a cedar box in his bureau for the past month, while he waited for a moment that felt like itself rather than like a performance of itself. He stopped her at the pharmacy steps. "Nell," he said, "I want to say something plain, because I've been unclear for long enough, and you are owed better than unclear." She looked at him. The lamplight caught the garnet color in her dark hair. "I love you," he said. "I know I was late to understand it, which is not a point in my favor, but I understand it now completely, the way I understand the work I'm most certain of, and I would like you to be my wife. If you're willing to take on a man who was slow and is doing his best to make up for it." She looked at him for a moment. "Fletcher Cade," she said, "that is the least romantic proposal I have heard described or imagined. I know. It had no poetry in it whatsoever. I'm aware." A pause. The cold November air moved down the empty street. "Yes," she said, simply, after 3 years of patience, a word that had always been waiting for the right moment to be said. He put the ring on her finger on the pharmacy steps in the November dark, and she looked at it the way you look at something that was always meant for you. They were married in December, before Christmas, in the same Methodist church where she had stood under the oaks at the 4th of July social and watched him turn away to talk about the river road. The church was full. Half of Hatchett's Crossing felt, with some justification, that they had personally witnessed and emotionally survived this courtship and deserved to be present at its resolution. Raymond Pruett, in the second pew, was observed to be suspiciously moved for a man who had spent 3 years acting as though the whole situation was merely an interesting problem to observe. Fletcher stood at the front of the church and watched Nell come down the aisle and felt, with a clarity that he suspected would stay with him for the rest of his life, how close he had come to not being here. How a man could stand next to something extraordinary for years and simply not see it. How Garland Fitch had been asking questions. How another month of his own comfortable blindness might have taken this possibility out of his hands entirely. He was not going to waste a day of what followed. They said their vows. They meant them. Every word. The years that followed were built from honest work and the specific contentment of two people who had chosen each other deliberately and never forgot that it had been a choice. The cooperage grew. Nell kept the pharmacy accounts and the cooperage accounts and at a certain point simply consolidated them because it was more efficient, and Fletcher had learned early that on matters of numbers and organization, Nell was simply right. Their daughter arrived in the second year. They named her June, because that was the month when things had finally started to move, and it seemed right to remember that. June had her father's patience and her mother's precision, which made her, by the age of 3, already more organized than most adults in Hatchett's Crossing. Their son came in the 4th year. They named him Cyrus for her father, who had sat on the porch, and told Nell to think carefully about how long was long enough to wait. Old Cyrus at the christening was so moved he had to pretend to examine something on the ceiling of the church. On a summer evening in their 7th year, Fletcher came home from the cooperage and stopped at the gate. Nell was on the porch, doing the accounts. She had a glass of sweet tea beside her. The evening light was gold, the way Louisiana evenings are gold in July, slow and warm and without any hurry about itself. The oak tree in the yard was doing what it always did. She looked up. "You're standing there," she said. "I know. You look like you're thinking about something." "I am," he said. He came through the gate. "I was thinking about the 4th of July social 7 years ago. How you smiled at me across the yard and I turned around and talked to Buck Alderman about the river road." She looked at him. "I think about that sometimes," he said. "How easy it almost was to miss the whole thing." "But you didn't," she said. "I almost did. Almost is not the same as did." She moved her papers to make room on the step. "Come sit down." He sat beside her on the step. The oak tree made its small sounds in the evening air. From inside the house came the sound of June explaining something to Cyrus with great authority, and Cyrus responding with a sound that indicated he was not convinced. "I see you," Fletcher said, quietly, not to the evening, not to the yard. To her, she leaned her head against his shoulder. "I know," she said. "You've been making up for lost time. Intend to keep at it." "Good," she said. Years later, when June was old enough to ask, she asked her mother how she had known. They were in the pharmacy, June learning the accounts the way Nell had learned them from her own father, and the question came in the middle of adding a column of numbers, sideways and unhurried. "How did you know Papa was worth waiting for?" Nell was quiet a moment. "He never pretended to be anything other than what he was," she said. "Every man who came along was trying to show me something. Your father just showed up himself every time, without any kind of arrangement to it." She turned a page in the ledger. "That's harder to find than people think." June considered this. "But you almost stopped waiting." "Yes," Nell said. "Almost." She looked at her daughter. "That's the part I want you to carry with you. Not the ending, the almost. Know what you want. Don't wait forever for someone who can't see you, but if the person you're waiting for is simply slow, a pause. Say the true thing, give them the chance to show up." She handed June the pencil. "What if they don't?" June asked. "Then you know," Nell said, "and you move forward." She looked at her daughter steadily. "But June, in my experience, when you say the true thing to the right person, they tend to show up." Nell Archer had not waited passively. She had lived her life fully, shown up as herself every day, without performance and without shrinking. She had run the accounts and baked for the church and said no to men who were good but were not right. And she had done all of this without making it into a statement or a sacrifice. She had simply known what she wanted and declined to pretend otherwise, and when the moment came, when she understood that patience had an edge and she was standing close to it, she had said the plain thing on a pharmacy step and let it land where it would. That is not a small thing. That is the whole thing, really. Fletcher was not a villain in this story. He was something more ordinary and more recognizable than a villain. He was a man so convinced that what he wanted was out of his reach that he never once tried to reach for it. Until Raymond Pruitt said Garland Fitch's name in the cooperage on a Thursday morning. Until the clock that had been running quietly became, all at once, impossible to ignore. Sometimes that's what it takes, not the arrival of love. That had been there for years in both directions, but the sudden, undeniable understanding that love, like everything worth having, does not wait on your convenience indefinitely. They chose each other at the last reasonable moment, but still in time. That's the part worth holding.